This is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. Okay, we are recording. This is the podcast of Multi-Faith Matters. I'm the host, John Moorhead, and we're thankful that you're either listening or watching today. This is one of many resources that we put together, and you can find not only other podcasts in both video and audio formats, but you can find suggested books, you can find links to articles, and all kinds of other things there. The website can be found at multifaithmatters.org. And we encourage you to check it out. And if you find this helpful, if you would give the podcast a rating and maybe even consider supporting this work. And what we're trying to do is help evangelicals and other Christians not only love God, but love their multi-faith neighbors in an increasingly pluralistic America and world. And I'm privileged today to have two guests that are going to be talking about their book. For those of you who are watching on the video, Sacred Dissonance. The subtitle is The Blessing of Difference in Jewish-Christian Dialogue. And my guests are Anthony Ladon and Larry. I know I asked Anthony before, but I know I'm going to butcher your last name. Larry Behrendt. Did I get it right?
Very close. Just put the emphasis on the first syllable, and you got it right.
Okay. Well, now that I got that out of the way, from now on you'll be Anthony and Larry, so I won't have to worry about stumbling over that. But let me tell the folks who you are here. Anthony is the executive editor of the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus, the author of several books and articles, and he also teaches New Testament at United Theological Seminary. And Larry is an attorney and a specialist in interreligious dialogue with a specific emphasis on Jewish-Christian relations, and he blogs at JewishChristianintersections.com, and you will find contact information in the program notes for those who want to follow up and see what these gentlemen are doing. Gentlemen, welcome to the program, and thank you for making time today.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed reading Sacred Dissonance. I wrote a review for Cultural Encounters Journal that folks might want to take a look at to kind of get my 2 cents on it. But before we unpack the book and start talking about Jewish-Christian dialogue and relationships, I'd like to find out a little bit about how you folks ended up where you are in terms of your present faith journey and commitments. Anthony, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Well, I grew up in a fairly evangelical household, and got interested in biblical studies because my sacred text was offered at many universities, and I thought I'd like to learn more about it from professionals. And the more I started learning about my own sacred text, I started learning that there were several ancient Jewish texts that were fascinating to me, and it turned out that a lot of the scholars that I was learning from, both by lecture and the scholars who I was reading about, and these ancient authors who I was reading their texts, they were Jewish. And so Judaism became an interesting, academically interesting to me, first and foremost. And that to me, so it was a very abstract thing before I actually intentionally, started up a conversation with someone who identified as Jewish and who wanted to talk about Jews and Christians. I'm sure I had several conversations with Jewish neighbors before that, but not in that intentional way. And of course, I think Larry and I met through this blog I used to do that was centered on historical Jesus research, and kind of struck up a relationship online. We online dated for a while, Larry and I, and And then we we got to know each other and decided it wouldn't be such a bad idea to write a book together. So I don't know if any of that needs to be fleshed out, but that's the gist of it anyway.
Sounds great. Larry, what's your story?
Well, I grew up in a family that I strongly identified as Jewish, but our actual Jewish religious practice was pretty light. And that was the pattern for much of my life until I, I met the person who became my wife. She was not Christian. She was not Jewish when we were married. She was a lapsed Protestant. And as she grew interested in Judaism, she began to insist that I not merely talk the talk, but walk the walk. And our Jewish practice grew together. So, in a sense, I came to I guess, a second life of Judaism through this Jewish Christian encounter of my marriage. But what particularly drew me as a Jew to be interested in Christianity was activity in the Jewish community around the release of Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. And I found in learning about the movie that I really should have had an independent interest in learning about Christianity. I mean, first to try to learn how to navigate our cultural landscape, but then simply because the topic was intrinsically fascinating to me. And I came to Jewish Christian dialogue really looking for people to talk to about this new interest of mine, who, not surprisingly, 99% of the people who like to talk about Christianity are Christians. And I found to participate in the conversation, I had to bring something Jewish to it. But it's obviously grown since then, but that's how it got started.
Anthony mentioned a little bit about how the book came about, but you're having these conversations. So why put it in book form?
I would think it's a little bit like some of the sessions that you have in college late at night. And you wake up in the morning and say, gee, that was a fascinating conversation. And you end up maybe taping one and you listen to it the next morning and say, there wasn't anything to that at all. That was just silliness. Anthony and I had a number of conversations, and I think it was, what would this look like in book form? And we tried it out. They said, this actually is pretty interesting. We at least thought it was interesting. I mean, but I think as a second part of this, and Anthony, I'll let you amplify this, is that we wanted to go beyond what we saw in typical Jewish Christian dialogue, which was kind of what we call sort of kumbaya dialogue, where the main goal was to come out of it feeling good. And we really enjoyed the conversations that we had that got uncomfortable. I mean, maybe not while the discomfort was there, but afterwards, when we had a chance to think about it and where we were.
I think that's right. I feel like some of the more interesting conversations we've had were conversations where I really didn't quite understand where Larry was coming from and what was behind it. What's behind the, how could someone who is so intelligent be so wrong on so many things, so often, so loud and wrong at the same time? And I thought, well, certainly there's something wrong with Larry, because there can't be anything wrong with me. And then and then of course I would think about it and I think, no, that can't be right. There must be a good reason why Larry and I disagree on this. And it was a lot of those follow-up apology conversations that we had that where we kind of really realized, oh, this is interesting. This is when we are disagreeing, it reveals something about not just ourselves, but sort of our backgrounds and presuppositions and things like that. And of course, I was always a perfect angel in all of these conversations.
It's true. It's true. I think the other advantage of, of recording and transcribing your conversations is that you can find out that from, conversation one to conversation two, it's possible both of us have switched positions.
It's
Um,
true. Oh, that's true. Yeah.
and that which happens, and I don't think we'd have any consciousness of the fact that we did that if we hadn't documented the earlier conversation.
Yeah,
It's
I think
true.
I think that point that you bring out is important. What I tend to practice, we call it multi-faith engagement or religious diplomacy, as distinct from interfaith, because and this is a generalization, and of course there are exceptions, but in my observation, many times interfaith tends to focus on commonality and to try and avoid difference.
Mm.
And certainly we don't want to focus so much on difference that we end up increasing animosity, but at the same time, I think it's important to talk about difference because many times our differences are more important than commonalities, perhaps. And one of the things I appreciate about what you said in the book that you've reiterated here is that you value civility, but at the same time you want to talk about difference. And you found those sometimes very difficult conversations helpful to the conversation.
Mm.
Would you agree with those observations?
I don't think I've ever put it like this. So Larry, you correct me if I've misspoken. I feel like civility is good as a posture, but not as an outcome. What do you think about that, Larry?
I think I don't want to diminish the achievement, that the first time Jews and Christians sat down together and achieved a civil result.
Right. Right.
I mean, we we've adopted a pretty expansive definition of what is dialogue. Um, so really, any time that there's a Jewish Christian encounter involving exchange of words, we would call that dialogue, even if it's one side is being forced to listen to the words of the other, or there's a threat of violence, behind the conversation. So the fact that we got to the point where we could sit down and it could be enjoyable and we'd walk out, feeling good. That's, again, let's not sneeze at that. Um, it's it's just I think Anthony and I felt that more was possible standing on the earlier achievements.
Mm.
Uh, Certainly, what I enjoyed most about my conversations with Anthony was, when they were provocative. When I walked away, with an idea that I never had before, um, as uncomfortable it might be. And I also found, again, one of the reasons that I enjoyed Anthony and still do as a conversation partner is that he's fun to challenge. He squirms, he makes interesting
I
noises.
do.
Um, and it's not everybody wants that experience. It's not everybody's idea of what is spiritual or sacred, or why one chooses to have a faith tradition as part of one's life.
Mm-hmm.
But I like being challenged. Anthony will at least endure it in a way I find entertaining. So there we go.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
that's not a bad thing to build on, I think, John, because I think that, like, are you the kind of person that likes wrestling with hard questions, or are those or do you prefer sort of neat answers? And if you like neat answers, then maybe Jewish Christian dialogue isn't your cup of tea. And I think that that's what the book is sort of trying to do. That says, look how complicated this is, and isn't it wonderful? um, and I think it's too much. I mean, I grew up in the evangelical world, and I know that a lot of that experience was about sort of arriving at, an understandable doctrine at the end of it.
right,
But that's not what Jewish Christian dialogue will provide.
right.
And so I think that the question is, are you the sort of person that likes to squirm a little bit and really sort of, you know, wring your hands over some really difficult and long-standing, troubling stories, puzzles, relationships, if that's your thing, if that's the thing that energizes you, then there's so many interesting topics in Jewish Christian relations that are worth exploring. That's my sense of it.
Well, my hope is that we can get more Christians and Jews and others to the point where even if it's not their, so-called cup of tea, that they realize that if we are going to address the challenges that we face, then we have to be willing to go to those difficult places. And it's like any relationship and conversation that has any depth to it. There's going to be a difference that has to be navigated. Otherwise, you're just having a conversation with yourself and you know basically discovering your and confirming your own assumptions along the way. I will say that I found your book challenging myself, and some of that will come out as we go through the conversation. In fact, in this next area here, I'd like to probe. One thing I found interesting that Larry said is, I'll quote from page 10 of the book, "I've never lost the sense that there's a danger in it in terms of this Jewish Christian dialogue." That may sound strange to a lot of Christians. Can you flesh that out? Why would a person like yourself find this to be a dangerous proposition?
Well, again, one of the interesting experiences in writing a book is that it could be that a week or 2 weeks after you write something, your feeling about it has changed a little bit. But one way to answer your question is to simply look at the Jewish Christian encounter historically. Um, and Jews have long memories. Memory is definitely a big part of the religious experience of being Jewish. Um, so I'm very much aware that when I take on this highfalutin term Jewish Christian dialogue, um, you know, of of the famous examples of Jews who have stood in dialogue with Christians and how that encounter ended up. It was often ended up badly for the Jew in the dialogue. Um, and we outlined some of those in the book. Um, so there is that sense of what came before, and honestly, I'm in no danger. Speaking to the Christians in which I'm in conversation, but that memory persists. Um, so again, that's part of it. Part of it is this is really an asymmetry in the way Jews and Christians approach each other. You really can't be Christian in any kind of serious sense without considerable grounding in Judaism, or at least a Christian view of Judaism. You spend as much time in the Old Testament as we do. Anthony's Hebrew is better than mine. That's necessary to be a Christian scholar. The mirror image is not the case. One can lead a thoroughly observant, rich Jewish life with almost no recognition or understanding of Christianity. So it is strange to us. And I probably don't need to tell you, but an immersion in American culture gives one an exposure to a lot of things that are ostensibly Christian, but not a really good look into the heart of Christianity.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with Larry. I think that maybe this is one of those times that we might swap positions by the end of this. But let me push back a little bit on that. I think that American Jews especially have a great exposure to Christianity just because, I don't know, they watch The Godfather, or something like it's in the ether. It's out there. It's on the billboards. It's in it's Christmas, that kind of thing. So I think that there's a great exposure to Christianity, but sort of a more secularized version of Christianity. And so whereas Christians will encounter Judaism on an academic level, I think in general American Jews are not all that interested in Christianity on an academic level, but their neighbor is probably Christian. I don't know. What do you think about that, Larry?
It's an interesting thing. I mean, yeah, you mentioned The Godfather. Um, my first serious read of the New Testament was in my 40s.
Right. Where I
And
grew up with, Noah's Ark, that sort of thing.
right. No. And so after reading the New Testament for the first time and going see my first Shakespeare play, after reading the New Testament, oh, that's where that comes from.
Sure. Right.
So we were exposed to a lot of Christianity in the culture without being able to identify it,
Yeah.
or to place it in a Christian context. So I'd seen bits and pieces of a lot of Jesus movies. And growing up in the 60s, Jesus tended to be this very gentle, long-suffering, extremely patient, if slightly exasperated, person, whose strongest emotional reaction might be a facepalm.
Right.
So the first time I read the New Testament, I said, "Whoa, Jesus is much more interesting than that." Jesus gets, I don't know whether this is theologically appropriate to say this, but Jesus seemed angry a lot of the time. Particularly in Mark, which is Anthony knows is my favorite gospel. Jesus is very, very recognizably human, and a much more three-dimensional figure than I'd had an awareness of. So without with experiencing all of the ramifications and echoes of Christianity in American culture without any grounding in Christianity is, I think, from both of your experiences, it's a very strange idea. And so, I mean, again, it's one of the reasons why I'm glad I finally picked up that book. Said, oh, okay, now I understand a little bit better. I'm never really going to get it. Picking it up for the first time at 40, it's not the same thing as growing up with it as a child.
Interesting.
Well, if Jews encounter Christianity in some form in the air, in the culture, what about the other side of the coin? Both of you weigh in. What do you think of Christian awareness and perceptions of Judaism? Is that a cardboard cutout? Is it idealized? Give me some thoughts on that.
Well, it's a little bit like, I don't know. I mean, I never said this. I've never said this out loud, and so Larry probably has never heard me say this before. But he probably knows I'm thinking it. That like it's like growing up in Northern California, where I grew up, and having some awareness of New York City, although having never been there. It's like it's impossible not to see New York City in movies or see it on the in sports broadcasts or whatever. And it's something a little bit, it's like, yeah, I recognize that as American, but it's a different kind of America. It's kind of exotic. It's a little bit, I don't quite understand why anyone will yell, I'm walking here. Isn't that obvious? So I don't really understand New York City, but it's kind of fascinating. And so I'm kind of poking at Larry here because he grew up in New York. But there's something about that Christians know a lot. I think they know a lot about Jews and Judaism because we talk about them every Sunday. We talk about the Israelites or the temple or the priests or the Pharisees or whatever. That's what we talk about on Sundays. Unfortunately, it doesn't. The Jews we're reading about don't always end up in the best light. And so in a lot of times that portrait isn't always a positive portrait. and a lot of times it's a negative portrait of Jews and Judaism. And from my experience, my Jewish neighbors didn't necessarily want to talk about Judaism. They would be much more inclined to talk about Buddhism or something else than they would want to talk about Judaism. And so I might have had Jewish neighbors I didn't even know were Jewish. So that's just it's one of those weird cultural as well as ethnic as well as religious borders it's really difficult to know when you've crossed the border. And now I'm in the Jewish world. There's just it's impossible to know that. Anyway, I don't know. I've rambled a bit on that. What do you think?
Well, we talk about this a bit in the book, and I guess I would say that Christians know enough about Judaism to understand their Christianity, which means that first of all, they're not getting the information firsthand, and they're getting the information that's necessary to explain why why Jesus, why they are Christians, what it means to be Christian. So we become something of the other that helps to explain the self. That's not going to be a very good way to understand this. It's also a little bit ancient. There have been a few important developments in Christianity since 1 AD, or whatever you'd like to date this. And so I will often walk into Jewish Christian dialogue for the first time, and I feel like I'm both disabusing notions that people might have had, but disappointing them. I'm not a Bible character. I'm very far from a Bible character.
Yeah.
And again, this is something Anthony brings out in some of his work, that in many ways there's a positive stereotype of Jews that Christians carry. That we're the people of the book, and we're the original recipient of God's promise, and we have stuck with it throughout adversity. And now look, there's a modern state of Israel. And isn't that a sort of aren't we a wonderful testimony to God and everything that's sacred? And we somehow in real life we don't seem to function. We're not able to live up to that. I don't think anybody could or should. So in some ways that positive stereotype hurts us.
Yeah, there's a mythology there. It's like depending on what version of Christianity we're talking about, it's like Larry's actually related to Abraham, like literally actually related to Abraham. That's some pretty good real estate. And a little bit envious, like, oh my gosh, like what would it be like, to trace my heritage, whatever. I don't know, that there's some kind of mythology around Jews and Judaism where it's really difficult to see the real basic humanity of our Jewish neighbors. Either they're closer to God because they're closer to Abraham, or how dare they reject Jesus, or what, who are they to still be waiting for the Messiah? Don't they know? That kind of thing. So it's difficult. It's difficult to sort of just emphasize sort of our common humanity above everything else. And yet I feel like my Jewish friends really don't like either exaggeration. They don't like being demonized. They don't like being lionized. So in fact, maybe Larry can speak to this. Some of my Jewish friends would prefer it if I didn't think about them at all. Like just forget I'm here, please. Just for 100 years, give me a break. That kind of thing.
I heard a rabbi say once that heaven on earth would be observant Jews and lax Christians. And I think he meant that as a joke. I mean, I'm actually positive he meant that as a joke. But yes, we often seem to do better when we're not noticed as much.
Right. Yeah.
And also, Anthony, as far as your DNA goes, Abraham maybe not, but Tiberius must be in there.
Yeah, maybe type. That's interesting. Yeah.
You have to get your DNA tested and find out.
Yeah. Just don't connect me with Pilate. I don't want that one.
But we can fine. You can disown Pilate. I'll disown Caiaphas. It will be both fine.
All right.
Well, to turn it a little darker here, one subject that you tackle in the book, which you have to in Jewish Christian dialogue, it has to do with the Holocaust or the Shoah. And there's a statement in there by Anthony where he talks about the memory of these horrific crimes that are the most important component of modern Jewish identity, perhaps the most important. Can you talk to how that can, again, you talked about Jews having a longer historical memory. I think Americans have a very short historical memory. Can you talk about how that important that continues to be in defining identity, how it shadows and shapes the ongoing Christian Jewish dialogue, and give some feedback on that.
Well, I'll just respond to the quote. I mean, and I think maybe I'd like to hear more from Larry on this, but this is one of those times where dialogue is risky. My encounter with Jews and Judaism is my own encounter, and it could be that some of my Jewish friends, and maybe if you've got Jewish listeners, would not like that association. The Jewish collective identity is tied to this horrible moment, the worst moment in the 20th century. Why not create a more positive collective identity? And yet, I think that there is something true about the importance of Shoah memory. That if memory shapes identity, there is something about learning a lesson, not just politically or a family history kind of lesson from the Shoah, but to also learn ethical lessons. Like how do we use what we know about what happens to disenfranchised people groups, and how do we apply that to our present situation? These are all useful tools of memory, and so I do think that at least for the 3 or 4 generations after the Holocaust, I think it is the Holocaust is going to continue to be an important shaper of Jewish identity. Now, I don't know, it could be that in 2 or 3 generations from now, there's a whole different Jewish posture towards that. But anyway, I'm curious to hear what Larry says about this.
Well, it's fundamental to Jewish identity to remember that we were slaves in Egypt. And Anthony and I have parsed that statement a great deal over the years. And for Anthony, it's absolutely fascinating that I refer to this as that we were slaves in Egypt.
Right.
So why is this why am I a slave in Egypt? But I mean, this is putting aside the whatever theology is there. This is something we are commanded to remember. And I was not a slave in Egypt, but my father was born in Berlin in 1927. His birthday is Hitler's birthday, the same day. He escaped as a refugee in 1936, and this was very much a part of my personal identity growing up, and because my father never talked about it until I was much older. Imagining what his life was like. And I, as a child, I had Nazi nightmares. They were recurring. They were common. It's a part of the Jewish psyche, at least for Jews of my generation. And I, again, we Anthony and I talk a lot about politics, and I think it's fascinating to both of us that American Jews, even white American Jews, vote so consistently to the left of the political spectrum. Even after other ethnic American minorities sort of drift to the center and right of
Mm,
center.
mm,
Um, Somehow this notion that we identify with the underdog, with the um, with people who are not born to the purple. Um, I heard the expression "born with a plastic spoon in one's mouth." Uh, I mean, I'm a very privileged character. I mean, I don't have much to complain about in my own life, but the identity of thinking of ourselves in terms of people who are on the other side of power and privilege is pretty central to what I think about being Jewish.
mm.
How well do you think we do in properly memorializing and keeping the significance of the Holocaust in front of us? We got this rise of anti-Semitism over the last few years. We said after the Holocaust, never again, and yet we continue historically to have various genocides. What aren't we getting here?
You know, the Holocaust is probably the best remembered, best documented, and best memorialized, genocide in human history. This is in my lifetime, is at least a somewhat recent development, because those Holocaust museums and the like did not exist in my childhood. And talking too directly about the Holocaust was somehow seen as, as impolite or too intimate or whatever. And that changed in my young adulthood. At this point, again, it's not that there aren't Holocaust deniers. It's not that there aren't, kids in some schools, who have either never heard of the Holocaust or don't really know what it is. But there's a lot of suffering, and a lot of killing, and a lot of dying. Um, I would like the Holocaust taught in a way that might help put an end to all of that. I would like to see us paying more attention to um, less well publicized, less well documented genocides.
Mm, mm, mm.
Anthony, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's also one of these things where well, I think I should make this point. I think that I could watch 1,000 documentaries on the Holocaust, and it's still not going to be for me what it is for Larry. For Larry, it's family history, um, and uh, and so for I think a lot of Christians, especially Christians who are in America and who associate, America with the good guys and the Nazis are the bad guys. There's a tendency to feel a little bit like well, this is, the good guys won at the end of this, and isn't it great the Allies won, and we did our best to make sure that, the Holocaust didn't happen, and we wouldn't have let it happen on our watch. I mean, I think that it's helpful to know more about the context, the religious context in Europe, and to know the sort of the Christian motivated anti-Semitism that led up to the event. These are things that we Christians may know a lot about the Holocaust academically, but for some reason we always associate ourselves with the good guys, and for whatever reason we let these Christian Nazis off the hook, because they're not us, they're the enemy. So I think that even though we are exposed quite a bit to the Holocaust, I think there's something more that's gained when we remember it in conversation with our Jewish neighbors. And I think that could just be it could be, you could get something from just looking at going to Yad Vashem in Israel, going to a Holocaust museum, something like that, where you would learn about the background to these things. But if the only people that you allow teach you about the Holocaust are academics and other people who are kind of World War II buffs, and you never talk to someone who actually experienced the Holocaust memory as family history, there's a whole side that's missing in the conversation. So I don't know. What do you think, Larry?
Well, I wanted to jump in and make sure, I mean, John, I'm sure you appreciate this, but I'm just one Jew here giving one Jew's opinion. I think if you ask the same question about the Holocaust to other Jews, you're going to get very different answers.
Mm-hmm.
That's an important thing to jump in here. Anthony is quite conscious sometimes of asking me the question, well, what do Jews think about this? Or what do you think Jews think about this? To try to get an answer out of me that's probably different than, one that's personal and, and might not be reflective. There's really no more fraught job for a Jew in dialogue than to try to represent an entire people. But I think that's important to point out here. Just to make certain that nobody walks away and says, well, gee, all Jews think X.
Yeah.
Based on hearing me. I mean,
yeah, right.
And again, I will try to represent, my people as best as I can, but you have to phrase the question that way. And it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily lead to our best dialogue, but again, sometimes Anthony wants to know. And I do my best.
I think it is interesting to know generalities. It's also true for Christians. I mean, I could say something like this. I could say, well, Christians, when they take Holy Communion, they are actually eating the blood and the body of Jesus, like literally. That's what's happening when they take communion, and that's probably true for billions of Christians. But it does not necessarily tell you much about, let's say, Protestant Christianity or other kinds of Christianity. Same thing about encountering the Holy Ghost, or you could name a host of things about Christians where it'd be better to say, a lot of Christians believe X, Y, or Z, or some Christians believe X, Y, and Z. It's just some little qualification sometimes can really be helpful.
And in dialogue, you've often needed to point out differences in America between white Christianity and Black Christianity or Christianity of color, and also the difference between American Christianity and Christianity, in the third world, Africa, South America, and that's usually valuable to me. I mean, I'm not surprised by the diversity of 14 million Jews worldwide, but somehow the fact that 2.7 billion Christians would be diverse, I constantly need that reminder.
Yeah, I think it's a great reminder. And of course, I don't speak for all evangelicals, although evangelicalism in America will be far better if they agreed with me, at least in multi-faith issues. But anyway, that's another thing. As our time begins to run, I have one final question for you. And this is an area here that I faced a challenge, and I think evangelicals will face a challenge in grappling with your book. Evangelicalism, I think many Christians, not just evangelicals, sharing their faith and wanting to see others embrace it is a big deal. It's an important part of their identity. They could look at the Great Commission to go and to make disciples, and they feel they have a serious responsibility to do that. And one of the things that makes multi-faith engagement or religious diplomacy different than interfaith, in interfaith contexts, proselytism is it's off the board. You just don't do that. However, in the kind of model that I follow, if it's welcomed by your conversation partner and it's appropriate in a given moment, there can be mutual attempts at persuasion. However, in reading your book, let's see, conversion is off the table. is one of the things you guys talked about. And you were quoted where you said, "We regard conversion as a loss of Jewishness, and ergo conversion efforts appear to us as seeking our destruction as a people." So when I read that, I thought, man, I appreciate that interest in evangelism is important to my faith identity. But if an aspect of my faith identity so threatens someone that I'm involved in dialogue with, then maybe I need to think about holding back on an aspect of what I hold dear. Gentlemen, would you unpack that for me? Share some thoughts.
Go. I'll go. I'll say a brief word, and then I'd like to hear more from Larry on this. But I think that there is something about when Larry enters the room with me to intentionally engage with a Christian, sit down at the table, Jewish Christian dialogue. There's like centuries of history warning him about the experience, like literally centuries of historical memory, collective memory that would say, yeah, but think about how many times and how many different ways this could go bad. And so for Larry senses a sense of danger, and for a lot of Jews, maybe not, in Larry's social context, but for a lot of Jews throughout the history of Jewish Christian relations, it was literal danger. It wasn't just like, oh no, I'm worried that they may say something that might make me mad or make me feel uncomfortable. There was literal danger involved in these encounters. Those things are not easily forgotten. And so if the ideal dialogue involves some kind of vulnerability, my Jewish dialogue partner is going to feel vulnerable in ways that I can't even imagine. And so then the question is, what kind of compromise can I make as a Christian, knowing that history? If that history is present to mind, am I willing to compromise anything in this, or am I just going to go in like a bull and just say, well, I'm sorry about the history, but I got things to say, damn it. That's just not the posture that would feel comfortable. I don't think that that's going to bring about the kind of dialogue that I'm looking for. Now I could be dead wrong on this, but I feel pretty adamant about it. I don't know where am I wrong or right, Larry?
There's a tension here. And there are competing goods to be balanced. I think in the book, we try to indicate that there is a level of authenticity and vulnerability that one has to bring into good dialogue. One has to be willing to open up. One has to be willing to consider and reconsider things that one might have felt were fundamental. But I guess I'd phrase the question as to why is it that a Christian wants to come and talk to me? Why is it that I want to go and speak to a Christian?